Silent films were, of course, rarely completely silent. From the very beginning, they were accompanied by music, most often by a piano or an organ. In fact, The Case of Lena Smith, the film that I'll be talking about this morning, was actually accompanied by a full orchestra, at least in Berlin. And that was also the case with many silent films that were produced after the year 1914. What is less well known, however, is that many very early silent films were also accompanied by a lecturer who would explain to the audience what was happening in the film. One cinema scholar has written that many very early silent films would have been virtually incomprehensible without the lecturer. Apparently, though, the lecturers began to die out after the year 1912, as the storytelling skills of filmmakers became more and more sophisticated. This morning, I'm going to show you my reimagining of a lost silent film by Josef von Sternberg. And I will serve as your lecturer for the presentation. Josef von Sternberg was born Jonas Sternberg in Vienna in 1894. When he was 14 years old, his family emigrated for the second and last time to New York, where he finished growing up. His path to becoming one of the most renowned filmmakers of his era was a long rise from poverty. The Case of Lena Smith was Sternberg's last silent film. It was released in the United States in 1929, but didn't make it to Vienna until February of 1930, where it was released just weeks before the release of The Blue Angel, Sternberg's most famous film, which is, of course, a film with full sound. Needless to say, The Blue Angel got a lot of attention. The Case of Lena Smith was more or less ignored. And that was not just because of the fact that the film was silent, but also because of its very dark and serious subject matter. Now, the majority of silent films ever made have disappeared without a trace. And The Case of Lena Smith more or less belongs to this group. I say more or less because, and this is really true, I didn't make it up, a 4-minute fragment of the film was found in a second-hand shop in China in 2002 by a Japanese film scholar. Now, I saw this fragment at the Austrian Film Museum in Vienna. And while I was watching it, I knew that I had actually seen the entire film before. When and where, I didn't know, and still don't. My only guess is that I saw it sometime during the 1960s, when as a teenager, I would go out on Saturday evenings and watch obscure films in tiny cinemas that no longer exist in the old city in Zurich, Switzerland. In the days and weeks after seeing the fragment, bits and pieces of the film kept coming back to me. So much so that I decided that my next project would be the reimagining of the film that I'm showing you today. Luckily, I was able to locate the original Austrian intertitles to the film at the Theater Museum in Vienna, and I'm using them in my presentation with their kind permission. As you can well imagine, these intertitles have been a great spur to my memory. But you'll notice that sometimes what the intertitles say and what I remember are not exactly the same thing. For Josef von Sternberg, the Case of Lena Smith, even though it takes place in Austria and Hungary during the years just before the start of the First World War, was universal, independent of place and time. And I'd like to point out that in this spirit of universality, many of the film clips and images that I use in my reimagining come from countries other than Austria and Hungary. For Sternberg, the film is the eternal story of women and mothers, and of their limitless love for and care of their children. Now, the film begins with a prologue that takes place at the military recruitment center in a small town in Hungary during the summer of 1914, just before the start of the First World War. Outside the recruitment center, there's a soldier playing a drum. Just inside the front door, there's a doctor examining a young man's teeth. And behind that young man is a line of other young men waiting to be examined. In the next room, there's a portrait of Emperor Franz Josef on the wall. Underneath the portrait is an Austrian flag. Next to it, a man is hanging up a poster, the Emperor's proclamation of July 28, 1914, in which he gives his reasons for declaring war on Serbia and asks his peoples to support the war effort. Now, there's a table beneath all of this. Two men are sitting behind it. One of them is Stefan, a very successful farmer who is also the chief official at the recruitment center. He is interviewing a line of young men about their enlistment into the army. One young man is asking to be excused from military service. He explains that his wife and mother depend upon him. As Stefan stamps the young man's form, he tells him that now is not the time to be thinking about wives and mothers. The young man turns around and walks away. The next young man steps up very quickly and says, "Father, let's get this over with. Just stamp the form. It doesn't matter whether I want to go or not." Reluctantly, Stefan also stamps this young man's form, and he too turns around and walks away. Stefan comments to the man next to him that he would rather cut off his right arm than send that boy off to war. The other man replies, "Stefan, don't you think that all fathers feel that way about their sons?" Stefan explains, "I was thinking about his mother. The boy is not my flesh and blood." Now, the actual film begins 19 years earlier, at the same little town in Hungary, at the same time of year. We see Stefan, much younger then, working on his farm, when he happens to look up and see a very pretty young woman walking down the road. This is Lena. He calls out to her, "Why are you so dressed up?" Lena shouts back, "I'm going to Vienna." Stefan explodes. "What? What about us? What about our wedding?" "Stefan, I promised my friends Peppy and Poldy that I would go to Vienna with them." "Lena, nothing good will come of your hanging around with those two." "I'm old enough to take care of myself, Stefan." "Well, you just go ahead and go then. I'm sure you'll be back here soon enough." "And what if I don't come back?" "Well then, I just might come and get you." Lena laughs, waves goodbye, and saunters off down the road. In the next scene, we see Lena and her two friends on their way to Vienna. The other two young women are talking about their plans for life in the big city. Peppy says she would like to work in a shop, whereas Poldy says she would prefer to work in a cafe. Lena's only comment is that anything would be better than slaving from dawn to dusk on a farm. In the next scene, we see the three young women at the Prater, Vienna's famous amusement park, on a beautiful midsummer evening. In his autobiography, titled Fun in a Chinese Laundry, by the way, the title comes from an early film by Thomas Edison, Josef von Sternberg writes of his great love for the Prater and how much he used to enjoy going there as a child. He even lists the attractions available at the Prater around the turn of the century. Some of them are pirouetting fleas, sword swallowers, grunting knife throwers, hatchet-throwing Indians, drum-thumping cannibals, bearded women, double-headed calves, magicians who can pour jugs of flaming liquid down their throats, hypnotists who can cause young women to levitate, and presiding over all of this, a huge Chinese mandarin on a merry-go-round with drooping mustaches longer than horses' tails. One by one, the young women are picked up by soldiers. Lena meets her lieutenant Franz on a boat in the Magic Grotto. We then see the two of them riding horses on a carousel, and then we see them in a beer garden. Lena is worried about her two friends. Lieutenant Franz tells her not to worry about them. She's with him now. He'll take care of her. Now this is an image from the original film. Next to it appeared an intertitle announcing that this was the beginning of a love affair between a simple country girl and an up-and-coming young lieutenant. The film now jumps 4 years into the future. Lena is working as a housemaid for Lieutenant Franz's parents. Franz's father is a Hofrat, a privy counselor to the emperor. But more importantly, he's also the head of the Bureau of Morals in the city. When we first see Lena, she's downstairs outside her building with the other maids, hanging up the week's washing. The other young women are kidding one another about their boyfriends. Lena says nothing. The others know that Lena sneaks out at night, but they have no idea where she goes or who she sees. Lena is then called by the lady of the house. On her way up the stairs, she picks up the mail. In it is a letter from Stefan. Lena is forced to explain to the Frau Hofrat that Stefan is writing to ask about his sister who lives in the city. The Hofrat then comes home for lunch. We see Lena helping him take off his boots. And then we see her serving the couple in the dining room. The doorbell rings. The Hofrat immediately wants to know who would dare disturb their meal. Lena answers the door. It's Franz. The two of them show no sign of knowing one another. She takes his hat and sword and shows him into the dining room, where the Hofrat immediately wants to know the reason for this unexpected visit. Franz's mother speculates that maybe their son has just come because he's hungry. Franz denies this. The Hofrat is suspicious, and he says so. He gets up and he takes Franz into another room where he immediately says, "You've been gambling again, haven't you?" Franz explains, "I only did it, Father, because my friends forced me to." "I've heard that excuse before. How much did you lose?" 300 crowns. The Hofrat explodes and starts shouting and tearing out his hair, with Franz all the while begging him to speak more softly so that the maid won't hear everything. As the Hofrat takes money out of his safe to give to his son, he assures him that this is the last time he will help him with gambling debts. The two of them return to the dining room, where Franz announces that he is now very hungry. The Hofrat ruefully comments that it cost him 300 crowns for his son to get his appetite back. He goes on to say that he'll be damned if this affair is going to cost him his afternoon nap. Lena shows Franz out. She gives him back his hat and sword. Franz looks at himself in the mirror. We can see Lena in the background looking at Franz. He leaves without saying a word to her. As the Hofrat and his wife get ready for bed, he comments to her that he's very worried that one day their son will disgrace the family name. The next scene takes place at the cafe, where Franz hangs out with his fellow officers. He's repaying his gambling debt. One of his friends asks him what his plans are for that evening. Franz explains that he has a date with a very beautiful young woman. It is now 10 p.m., and Vienna has locked its doors for the night. After this hour, only janitors have keys to let people in and out of buildings. By chance, the Hofrat has seen Lena looking at a picture of Franz on the wall, and he's become suspicious. For her part, Lena has put on her hat and coat and sneaked out of the apartment. On her way out of the building, the janitor's wife asks her what she thinks will happen when the Hofrat discovers what she does at night. Meanwhile, the Hofrat has discovered Lena's absence, and he and his wife go through all of her things, especially the suitcase under her bed, where they find letters from Stefan and a picture of Franz. The Hofrat immediately puts on his hat and coat and heads for his son's apartment. A blonde barely has time to jump out of bed and hide on the balcony before the Hofrat storms into Franz's bedroom, where he finds absolutely nothing. After a few words with his bewildered son, he turns around and goes home. The blonde reappears from the balcony. It is not Lena. The scene now changes to Stefan's sister's apartment, where we see Lena comforting a little boy. Stefan's sister comments that her brother has written that he plans to come to Vienna soon. Lena asks her if she's ever told Stefan anything about Lena's son. The young woman replies, "Heavens, no, Lena, I would never do that. You know that Stefan is still crazy about you." Lena wonders what Stefan would think if he ever found out that she was a mother. It is now the next morning at breakfast, and the Frau Hofrat is pleading with her husband not to be too hard on Lena, because after all, good help is hard to find. The Hofrat says that may well be true, but he will not tolerate having a slut in his Christian home. Lena arrives in the dining room with a newspaper, and the Hofrat immediately asks her where she'd been the night before. Lena says she was in bed asleep. The Hofrat blurts out, "You're lying, where were you?" Lena lies again. She says she went out for a walk. The Hofrat then asks her where she got the picture of his son. Lena says she tore it out of a magazine. The Hofrat then wants to know how a mere serving girl could have the audacity to want to have a picture of his son. And he assures Lena that if it ever happens again, he will fire her immediately. And he goes on to point out to Lena that he is not only her employer, but he is also the head of the Bureau of Morals in the city. Summer has now come, and on her monthly day off, Lena has taken her little son to the Prater, where she fondly remembers having met Franz there 4 years before. Unfortunately, though, the janitor of her building and his family are also at the Prater that day, and they see Lena there with her son, and they rush home to tell the Hofrat what they've discovered. And so, when Lena returns to the apartment that evening, the Hofrat meets her at the door, demands her key, and fires her on the spot. For her part, Lena demands to be paid first, and tells the Hofrat that he's an old coot. Remember, this is 1929. and that she could really open his eyes if she wanted to. On her way out of the building, she has words with the janitor telling him that he's a scandal monger. And she was sure that he could hardly wait to get home to tell the Hofrat what he'd seen. Lena, of course, goes to Stefan's sister's apartment, where she finds the young woman sitting on the bed crying. She tells Lena that 2 policemen came and took her son away. In the next scene, we see Lena's little boy crying himself to sleep in an orphanage. And then we see Lena at the Bureau of Morals demanding to know what has happened to her child. An official comes out of the back room and wants to know who's making all the noise. Lena repeats her demand. The official asks Lena for her name. She looks him in the eye and says, Eleonora Anna Maria Teresa Semeseghieri. The official wants to know how the hell they're supposed to keep track of such a name in their records. He tells her that from then on she'll be known as Lena Smith. The official explains to Lena that the head of the Bureau of Morals has declared her unfit to be a mother, saying that she lacks all of the qualities necessary to successfully bring up a child. Lena blurts out that he's lying, and he has no right to talk about her like that. The official then asks Lena for the name of the little boy's father. Lena refuses to give it. In the end, the official tells Lena that they must be sure that the little boy is brought up safely and properly, and that Lena can have her son back if she can show that she has 500 crowns. In the next scene, we see Lena looking in the window of the cafe where Franz is seated with his colleagues. Franz sees Lena, but he doesn't get up right away. Finally, he does. He leaves the cafe and starts walking down the street. Lena follows him. Suddenly, Franz stops, turns around and says, "Is there no place that I'm safe from you? You're going to embarrass me in front of my friends." "Franz, 2 policemen came and took our son away, and we have your father to thank for it." "Lena, you know that I'm very sorry for you, but there's absolutely nothing that I can do." "Franz, I can get our son back if I can show that I have 500 crowns. "Lena, where is a poor lieutenant supposed to get so much money?" "Franz, you're forcing me to tell your father that you are the father of my son. Do what you have to, Lena, but then everything would be over between us." Lena returns to Stefan's sister's apartment, where the eternally optimistic young woman meets her at the door and says, "Lena, I have a big surprise for you." Lena's head is immediately filled with possibilities. Needless to say, she's hoping that her son has been miraculously returned when the bedroom door opens and Stefan comes out and says, "Hi, Lena, how are you?" And then quickly adds, "You don't have to lie. I know everything." Now, this is a point where it'd be interesting to see the original film. What is Stefan's emotion here? Is he shocked? Is he crushed? Is he angry? Or is he perhaps all three at once? He then asks Lena what is going to happen with her son. Lena looks him in the eye and says, "Stefan, I can get my son back if I can show that I have 500 crowns. Stefan blurts out, "Where the hell are you going to get so much money? On the street?" Needless to say, Stefan regrets having said that the instant the words are out of his mouth, and he turns around and goes back into the bedroom. Lena slumps down into a chair. She no longer cares what Stefan thinks. That's his problem. He'll have to deal with it. Stefan then reappears from the bedroom and not very gently drops money into Lena's lap and says, "There, 400 crowns. all I've been able to save in 10 years of hard work. You'll have to get the rest somewhere else. And then he stands there, trying to think of something else to say. In the end, all he can come up with is, "Goodbye, Lena. I'm going to go home now." At the sight of the money, Lena's jaws dropped open like that of a marionette at rest. And for the second time in minutes, her head is filled with possibilities. But these possibilities are quickly overwhelmed by the realization of how much Stefan loves her. And for the first time in days, a little smile comes to her lips. And she looks up at Stefan and she says, "How can I ever thank you?" For the longest time, Stefan doesn't reply. The two of them stare at one another. In the end, though, Stefan does speak. And what he says is, "You don't have to thank me, Lena, but it sure would be nice if you would come home soon." In the next scene, we see Lena once again looking in the cafe at Franz. A waiter brings Franz a note. He reads it, gets up, goes outside, meets Lena, and says, "What is it now?" "Franz, you have to give me 100 crowns. Lena, you know I don't have any money. If you don't have it, you can get it from your father. I already have 400 crowns. I only need 100 more to get our son back." Needless to say, Franz wonders where Lena got so much money. And he asks her about it. But he doesn't wait for an answer. He's thinking. What he actually says is, "Do you have the money with you?" Lena shows it to him. He takes it and he says, "Lena, everything is going to be fine. With this, I can easily win 1,000 crowns this evening." Lena is more realistic. She says, "But you could just as easily lose it all." "Not a chance, Lena. You be at my apartment at 11 p.m. and I'll give you all the money you need." And so at the appointed hour, Lena is standing outside Franz's door. Franz is writing a letter. Lena rings the doorbell. Franz answers it. Lena immediately asks, "Do you have the money?" Franz says nothing. He takes Lena by the arm, kisses her on the cheek, turns around, goes into the bedroom, and closes the door. There, he takes off his house coat, puts on his military jacket, looks at himself in the mirror, and picks up a revolver. All we see is a wisp of smoke floating across the mirror. And then we see Lena jump up in the next room, rush into the bedroom and look down. Then we see a policeman rushing up the stairs to Franz's apartment, rushing into the bedroom, looking down, then looking up at Lena and asking, "What is your name?" The scene now changes to the inquest into Franz's death. Lena is being kept in an anteroom to the court where she's guarded by a policeman. The policeman puts his ear to the keyhole just in time to hear the judge's chief advisor explain that their investigation has shown that Lieutenant Franz Holtz died by suicide. We are now inside the courtroom where the judge is advising the Hofrat to let the entire matter drop and not to pursue it any further. The Hofrat disagrees. He demands that Lena be questioned. Reluctantly, the judge gives him permission to question Lena himself. Lena is brought into the courtroom where she sits down. The Hofrat immediately asks her what she was doing in his son's apartment on the night of his death. Lena says nothing. The Hofrat then comments that her silence is proof of her guilt and her shame for being such an immoral person. Lena says nothing. The Hofrat then says that they will find a way to make her talk. Lena says nothing. Finally, the Hofrat loses whatever patience he may have, and he blurts out, "If you don't answer my question, you'll never see that brat of yours again." The judge quickly reminds the Hofrat that the child has nothing to do with the matter at hand. Lena then blurts out that the Hofrat is forcing her to tell him that his son is the father of her child. And she pulls out a document and says, "And if you don't believe me, this is a little boy's baptismal certificate." The judge examines the document, pronounces it genuine, and tells Lena that she may go. Lena then demands to know when she can get her son back. The Hofrat is now furious. He says that since his son is the father of the child, he will take over the child's upbringing himself. Lena is now furious. She says there is absolutely no way she will let him take her son away from her, and that now the gloves are off and she will be shouting from every street corner in Vienna that Lieutenant Franz Holz is the father of her son, and that no Bureau of Morals, no police are ever going to keep her from getting her son back. Lena is dragged from the courtroom. The judge is very worried that this entire affair could become a public scandal. He says something must be done. His chief advisor has an idea. He says that 6 months in a workhouse will calm Lena down and make her forget the whole thing. The judge agrees. Now, the last section of the Case of Lena Smith goes very quickly and without further intertitles until the very end. Esther Ralston, the actress who played Lena Smith in the film, wrote in her autobiography that for this last section, Josef von Sternberg had mud thrown all over her, forced her to climb a barbed wire fence that cut her hands and made them bleed, and aged her from being a young girl to an old woman. One biographer of Sternberg has written that for him, this last section of the Case of Lena Smith is one of the most searing sequences in the entire history of film. Lena is taken from the courtroom to a woman's prison, where she's dragged kicking and screaming and thrown into a cell where she is then mercilessly beaten by a ruthless matron with a whip. We then see Lena the next morning, along with the other women, being marched out to a cornfield to work. By lunchtime, however, Lena has escaped, and we see her running through the cornfields until she finds a ditch where she covers herself with mud and hides until nightfall. Then she gets out, and we see her climbing a barbed wire fence to escape the prison, all the while being shot at by guards. Finally, she drops onto the other side of the fence, and we see her escape into a forest, where she runs like a frightened deer all the way back to the city and to the orphanage where she thinks her son is being kept. When daylight comes, we see her looking over the wall of the orphanage, trying to find her son. Finally, she does see him. That night, she sneaks into the dormitory and goes from bed to bed until she finds her sleeping little boy. She picks him up, and the two of them escape through an open window. We then see Lena carrying her son, running through the streets of Vienna, every once in a while hiding in a doorway to make sure they're not being followed. And then we see her continuing to run along country roads throughout the night until daybreak, when she slows down to a walk, realizing that she and her son have not been followed and are on their way home safe. And a little smile comes to her lips. We now come to the epilogue to the film, which takes place in the same little town in Hungary on the same day as the prologue. We see Lena, much older then, tearfully saying goodbye to her son as he's being marched off to war with the other young men. And then we see her in conversation with her husband, Stefan. She's asking him, why does it always happen that when everything seems to be going so well, the crops are ready to be harvested, and everyone is so happy, that something always comes along to ruin everything? And Stefan answers by telling her what many Europeans were telling one another during the summer of 1914, that the war would most probably only last for a couple of months, and that she would have her son home by Christmas. The final words of the final script of the Case of Lena Smith are, all of her struggles, all of her sufferings, all of her sacrifices, and all of her hopes had been for nothing. She had lost her son.